lot.
Like many movie lovers in 2016, I'm a big fan of David Fincher. And what's not to love? He has a distinct visual style, he has a clear point of view that's been mostly consistent through his filmography, and most importantly, his movies always turn out pretty damn good, no matter what story he's telling. Whether it's acclaimed transgressive literature, an Aaron Sorkin script about recent events, what amounts to an airport paperback, a retelling of Forrest Gump, or whatever this is. And while a lot of people know him and love him due to Seven and Fight Club, I feel like Fincher didn't become Fincher until Zodiac. While those are certainly good movies, I can't help but feel the visual style wasn't quite as polished, but it coalesced in Zodiac and has been consistent ever since. All I mean to say is, the look of his earlier movies is just generic enough that they could be from another director other than Fincher, as opposed to, say, this, which is no one but Fincher. This is no one but Fincher. This is no one but Fincher. This is largely due, maybe entirely due, to the fact that Zodiac is the first movie he shot digitally as opposed to on film, and he hasn't looked back since. That's the first reason I consider Zodiac the Fincheriest Fincher movie. It's where his distinct visual style became his distinct visual style. The other reason I give it that title is because you can find traces of most of his other movies in Zodiac. Sociopathic serial killer, specifically one that taunts their pursuers. A cat and mouse theme. Social commentary. The futility of intimate relationships. Protagonist is a social outsider. Subtle CGI in a story where the need for CGI isn't immediately obvious. Protagonist feeling powerlessness at the hands of criminals. A true crime story, centering around a journalist. Life-consuming obsession. Among all these different facets and all these different characteristics, the most important among them is obsession. That's what lies at the heart of the movie, and that's what makes it definitively a Fincher movie. The polite way to say it is that Fincher is a particular filmmaker. The blunt way to say it is that Fincher is an obsessive filmmaker. It's widely known that he demands dozens of takes from his actors. Jake Gyllenhaal says that they did 70 takes of several scenes in Zodiac, sometimes up to 90. Rooney Mara claims they did 99 takes of one scene in The Social Network. There are reports that he averaged 50 takes per scene when filming Gone Girl. But what it really comes down to is that he wants things a certain way, and he will keep working until he gets things a certain way. Other people be damned. Robert Downey Jr. famously started leaving jars of his own urine around the set of Zodiac, as a form of protesting what he thought were ridiculous expectations from his director. The movie is based on a book by Robert Graysmith, but Fincher and his screenwriter weren't satisfied to trust Graysmith's book, which he took 10 years to research and write. They sought out the actual police reports of the various murders, but they weren't satisfied then either. Fincher and his producers hired teams of private detectives to track down the surviving victims of the Zodiac and personally interviewed them. All told, they spent 18 months researching this movie, digging into archives that had already been combed through, reading documents that had already been read. They went so far as to helicopter in trees for the Lake Berryessa scene, as that area had since changed, and Fincher wanted it to resemble 1969 as accurately as possible. My point is, there's thorough, and then there's Fincher. The result is a movie about obsession, obsessively made by an obsessive filmmaker. It's interesting to me that a movie supposedly about the Zodiac Killer doesn't really focus much on the Zodiac Killer. Fincher was actually adamant that he didn't want to show the point of view of the killer because he didn't want to glorify what the killer did. So he instead focused on the investigation and how it completely consumed the people involved.
Okay, the Rick Marshalls of this world will suck you dry. They're blind alleys.
And no one more than Robert Graysmith. As I alluded, Robert is an outsider.
Graysmith, don't you have a cartoon to finish?
Oh, yeah.
Morty's? Anyone? Where I'm heading.
And he doesn't seem to have much in his life outside of the Zodiac. So in that sense, he's a likely candidate to be taken by the obsession. The thing is though, he does have something in his life outside of the Zodiac. He has a family. But to him, that's secondary to his obsession.
Don't tell Mom about our special project, okay?
How come you and Mom don't sleep in the same bed anymore?
Again, the movie is based on Graysmith's book, and thus, in some sense, wouldn't exist without him, and yet it really doesn't let him off the hook. He's far from admirable, and is actually really selfish. In a very short-sighted move, he publicizes his personal Zodiac investigation in the Chronicle, and even shows his face on TV, putting himself and his family at risk.
Hello, who is this?
What's the one thing we know about Zodiac? He reads the Chronicle?
He feels the need to solve the Zodiac case, not because the Zodiac's still killing people and the public is at risk.
It's 4 years ago. Let it fucking go.
Zodiac hasn't written in 3 years. You know how many murders we've had in San Francisco since then? No? Over 200?
But because he needs to know.
I need to know who he is. I need to stand there. I need to look him in the eye. And I need to know that it's him.
It's a puzzle for him to solve, and by that point, nothing more.
I like puzzles. I do them a lot.
So, our main character is far from likable, which is a Fincher hallmark. He seems to thrive on having an unlikable protagonist. Another Fincher hallmark is that his movies are very difficult, not just for their unlikable protagonists, but also for their brutality and bleakness, both of which are ever present in Zodiac. But Zodiac is easily his most difficult movie. First of all, it's disjointed, and that can be jarring. Sometimes it feels like 3 or 4 movies rolled into one, from both a plot and a visual standpoint. At times, it looks like a thriller. At times, an investigative journalism movie. At times, a police procedural. At times, a horror movie. At times, a character study, though not about the character you would think. The last hour feels almost like a completely different movie than the first hour and a half. The first hour and a half is mostly centered on Dave Toschi and his investigation, with occasional focus on Robert. The last hour is pretty much entirely centered on Robert and his investigation, with occasional focus on Toschi. In the first hour and a half, there are a lot of fade-ins and fade-outs, usually bookending a Zodiac encounter, to create this unsettling mystery about what's happening. In the last hour, because the Zodiac is mostly absent, outside of breathy phone calls, these fade-ins or fade-outs cease entirely. The only fade-in or fade-out in the last hour of the movie is here, when Robert confronts who he believes to be the Zodiac. So, yeah, the movie's difficulty is in part due to its disjointedness, but mostly because it's a supremely frustrating story. The movie is over 2.5 hours of an investigation of a single figure, and we don't even have so much as a suspect until 77 minutes in. That leaves a ton of time spent on leads that end up going nowhere, like with Rick Marshall. It's only because an anonymous phone call puts him on Rick Marshall does Robert find himself at this house. While this is an incredibly intense scene and possibly the movie's most memorable, you have to keep in mind that, in the scheme of things, this scene is a complete dead end and has nothing to do with the Zodiac. But that doesn't make it any less scary or intense. This scene is actually a good microcosm for the movie as a whole. Robert is so close to cracking the case, he just needs one more bit of information and he'll have it. But suddenly he realizes he's wrong. Not only is he wrong, he's in danger. His search for answers is putting him directly in harm's way. But he's not actually in harm's way. It was just paranoia. But that's the price he's paying. The reason it's unsettling that the Zodiac was never identified is that anyone could be the Zodiac, including the guy who just invited you into his house seemingly on the pretense of helping you out. Anyone. Certainty becomes uncertainty. Becomes intense fear.
Are you sure there's nobody else in the house?
Which reveals itself to have just been paranoia. That's the movie in a nutshell. And after more than 2.5 hours, we still don't get a definitive answer. All things considered, this ending is about as satisfying as it could have possibly been. For example, they could have filmed the characters learning of Arthur Lee Allen's death and ended with that scene instead of putting it in a title card. Or they could have ended with this scene and put this scene in a title card. Among the options they had to work with, within the confines of the true story, what they went with is probably best. And considering how much time and effort the filmmakers put in to ensure the accuracy of this movie, this amount of certainty and closure is probably the most they could responsibly give us. And yet, it still feels like an ellipsis rather than a period, which makes the movie all the more difficult to swallow. And I think the difficulty of Zodiac, even by Fincher standards, may have made the movie unappealing to some people. I'm not saying the Academy Awards are the end-all be-all of a movie's appeal, but Zodiac got 0 nominations, while Fincher's follow-up, the far inferior but much less difficult Benjamin Button, got 13. But beyond its difficulty, audiences may have found Zodiac unappealing because of the culpability of the audience. And yet, I think this is one of its most fascinating aspects.
I'm not the Zodiac.
Robert's interest in the Zodiac starts out innocently enough, but it soon becomes perverse. His obsession with the Zodiac costs him his marriage and completely consumes his life. Notice that Robert has a dark brown jacket for the first hour and a half of the movie, when his interest in the Zodiac is still just a curiosity. In the last hour of the movie, when his interest in the Zodiac becomes a full-blown obsession, what is he wearing?
Not one, but two blue windbreakers. We'll have those checked for blood.
A blue windbreaker. Just about every time we see him in the final hour, he's traded in his brown jacket for the one associated with the Zodiac. He begins as an outside observer of a serial killer story, but because he just can't stay away and can't let it go, he becomes a part of the serial killer story. And guess what? The audience is Robert. Yes, as the protagonist of the movie, Robert is the audience stand-in, but it goes beyond that. The reason the Zodiac exists in the first place is because people are interested in killers. People like Robert. People like us.
He's in it for the press. Bobby, you almost look disappointed.
If the Zodiac didn't send taunting letters to the press, or if the press just sat on them and never printed them, do you think we'd still be curious about the Zodiac today, 40, 50 years later? No. It would just be another stack of unsolved murders. End of story. But the Zodiac did write letters. The press did publish them. The Zodiac fed into the public's perverse interest in mass murderers. Yes, we can chastise Robert for being pulled into the serial killer story, but are we any better?
Does the fact that most of us know the names of mass murderers, but never heard of John Orton, say anything about us?
And this is still very, very much relevant today. We're still, as a society, fascinated by murder. Just look at the recent success of the Jinx, Serial, Making a Murderer, and sometimes our societal interest becomes perverse. And just like Robert, our interest in serial killer stories can become a part of the serial killer stories. It's a vicious cycle. News coverage of killers feeds the public's interest in killers, which in turn can create more killers. For example, the Columbine shooters were inspired by the Oklahoma City bombing. Mass shooters are leaving behind manifestos on YouTube, attempting to draw public attention to their heinous acts, and knowing full well that they'll get it. There's a large public push right now to remember the victims, not the shooter. And yet, a lot of people can still rattle off the names of recent mass shooters. And so, Zodiac is a movie about a real-life serial killer that held the nation's attention for decades. In that sense, it's a document of a time when we were swept up by a serial killer story. Just by its very existence, the movie fills that curiosity that people today still have in serial killer stories. And yet, it's also an indictment of our interest in serial killer stories, both then and now. It's both a criticism of, and a part of, our serial killer infatuation.
It's very real. You know how I know? Because I saw it on TV.
So while I do think Zodiac is one of the best movies of the past decade, maybe other people didn't respond to it because it has such a disdain for its audience. On some level, it puts the blood on our hands. David Fincher once said,
I think people are perverts. I've maintained that. That's the foundation of my career.
And maybe in this case, he's right.
Does anyone ever call me names? Or...
You mean like return?
Yeah.